In the heart of ancient Athens, the city that gave the world philosophy, art, and the very concept of democracy, a human soul had a price tag. A night with a woman in the city's brothels cost the same as 2 barley flatbreads. Her body was valued at less than a jug of cheap wine. These women were known as pornai, a term that wasn't just a job title, but a brand of social death. It marked them as the absolute lowest rung of society. Less than citizens, less than slaves with other trades, existing as little more than chattel. To ensure no one mistook them for anything else, each woman was seared with a hot iron, her thigh bearing a permanent brand that declared her living merchandise, owned and sold like livestock. This wasn't a hidden, shameful secret. This was the engine room of the Athenian economy, an accepted and taxed part of the society that built the Parthenon. The marble pillars of civilization cast long, dark shadows, and in those shadows, countless women were stripped of their names, their freedom, and their humanity. To understand the golden age of Athens, we must first be brave enough to walk through its darkest rooms. For a new girl brought to the brothel, the transition from person to property was swift and absolute. There was no gentle introduction, no period of adjustment. There was only a brutal, public ritual designed to systematically dismantle her identity. The first rape came almost immediately upon arrival. But this was no hidden crime. It was a public performance, staged in front of the other seasoned pornai and the brothel's regular clients. This was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. The ancient writer Pappy from Thessaly described it as a calculated spectacle designed to break her shame and crush her will. The goal wasn't just to violate her body, but to annihilate her spirit in front of an audience. And that audience participated, shouting encouragement and turning a soul-shattering trauma into a spectator sport. This process of unmaking was so central to the business model that new girls fetched prices several times higher than those already broken. Men would pay a 10-fold premium for a night with a virgin, a fact noted by contemporary writers with the same casual indifference as choosing the ripest fruit at the market. The high price wasn't for innocence, it was for the power to be the one who destroyed it. The breaking of a woman wasn't a tragic byproduct of the system, it was the system's most valuable product. The Athenian brothel was more than a marketplace for sex, it was a marketplace for pain. For the men who walked through its doors, the experience was highly customizable, and pimps curated their slaves like a grotesque catalogue of human suffering. Women were categorized and marketed by their most exploitable traits. There were Nubian women, dwarves, mutes, and those labeled as fighters or unbroken, each with her own price point and her own dark devotees. This commodification of cruelty is etched into the historical record. 5th century vase paintings, objects of art meant for display, depict horrific contests where men competed to overpower a resisting girl for sport. This wasn't just abuse, it was gamified sadism. The walls of the brothels themselves told the story. Graffiti left by clients reveals they would pay extra to spoil the goods, to permanently maim, scar or disfigure a woman's face or body. In this twisted economy, brothels sold violence as a premium service. Torn lips, broken teeth, or fresh burns from an oil lamp weren't seen as damage. For a certain clientele, these were desirable features they were willing to pay for. The very evidence of a woman's suffering became the product. In the city that perfected the art of tragedy on the stage, the most lucrative craft was turning real human agony into a transaction. If the daily life in the brothel was a nightmare, the sacred festivals were a descent into an even deeper level of hell. During religious celebrations, especially the Dionysia, a festival honoring the god of wine, fertility, and theatre, the thin veil of a commercial transaction was ripped away. Prostitutes were handed over to teeming groups of men, not for a price, but for free, as a mandatory part of a so-called sacred fertility ritual. Ancient sources describe these events with chilling shamelessness. Mass gang rapes unfolded in public, set to the festive strumming of lyres and the pouring of wine. Men placed bets on a victim's endurance, their laughter mingling with her cries. On these holy days, a woman was stripped of even the shadow of her humanity, reduced to a ritual beast, a sacred plaything for a drunken mob celebrating their gods. The consequences were lethal. A physician's journal from the period soberly notes the aftermath. Deaths from ruptured organs, asphyxiation during gang assaults, and total collapse from blood loss and pain. And this was all sanctified. Dionysia's priests blessed these orgies as pleasing to the god, allowing the blood of ravaged women to mingle with spilled wine on the city's altars. When the festivals ended, Any survivors who could still move were dragged back to the brothels to continue their work. The dead were simply carried beyond the city walls and dumped in ravines, discarded like any other sacrificial refuse. Behind the walls of the brothel, pain was not just an event. It was a system. It was an architecture of control built on a foundation of daily routine punishment for the smallest of infractions. Spilling a cup of wine, misspeaking a client's name, or even shedding a tear was enough to trigger a savage response. Women were beaten with rods, leather straps, or bare fists. With a chillingly bureaucratic euphemism, these punishments were called character correction. A woman might be locked in a dark, airless storeroom for days without food or water, or she could be tied to a stone pillar in the courtyard, left to freeze in wet rags on a winter night, or bake under the summer sun without a single sip of water. This system of control even extended to the clients, as pimps often allowed their loyal customers to discipline the women, effectively sanctioning torture as a perk of doing business. For acts of defiance, the punishment escalated to rape with objects. Wooden clubs, wine goblets, or knife handles were all used as tools of subjugation. The psychological result of this constant, unpredictable violence was a state of total submission. Slaves quickly learned that crying or showing pain only fueled their master's rage. They were forced to mask their agony with smiles, becoming performers in their own debasement. What does it do to the human spirit when a single tear can cost you days of agony? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. In a system of such complete oppression, the human spirit still clings to one desperate idea: escape. But in Athens, even hope was an illusion. Under the city's laws, an enslaved woman who ran was not a victim fleeing abuse. She was classified as stolen property. The response was not a rescue, but a brutal public retribution, designed to make an example of her. If caught, a runaway was branded with a hot iron, not on her thigh, but on her forehead or chest, a permanent, public declaration that she was defiant property. For the ultimate crime of escaping during a religious festival, the punishment was crucifixion. Court records confirm that fugitive porni were nailed to wooden planks and displayed in the Agora, the bustling heart of Athenian civic life, left to die as a public warning. They died slowly from thirst, infection, or gangrene festering around the nails. With the law as their enemy, some women sought a higher authority, desperately seeking refuge in the city's temples. They would cling to the altars of the gods, praying for divine protection. But even here there was no sanctuary. Priests would hand them straight back to their owners in exchange for a small fee. In Athens, the rights of property were more sacred than the altars of the gods. Each failed escape only led to more sadistic punishments, sealing every exit and proving that for the porni, the entire world was a prison with no walls and no key. The violence inflicted upon the porni was not always swift. More often, it was a slow, agonizing decay. According to Hippocratic treatises of the era, these women rarely lived past the age of 25. Their chief killers were not just beatings, but the silent plagues of venereal diseases, sepsis from constant injuries, chronic exhaustion, and raging urinary infections. The logic of the brothel owner was chillingly simple. Treatment was unprofitable. A brand new slave cost less than a single visit from a doctor. So, women with festering sores, foul discharges, and open wounds were forced to continue working until they physically collapsed. Clients would complain about the stench of rot and blood, for which the pimps would then beat the sick women, as if more pain could somehow heal their decaying flesh. For centuries, this was only known through written accounts, but today, the bones tell the story. Archaeological digs near ancient brothels have unearthed a library of suffering. Female remains show deformed pelvic bones from forced sex and traumatic births, skulls with multiple fractures, ribs bearing the telltale marks of being broken and healed over and over, and misaligned vertebrae, a silent ledger of systematic violence written in bone. When a woman's body was finally too broken to be profitable, she was carried beyond the city walls, alive or dead, and dumped like shattered pottery. For a porna, pregnancy was not a life-giving miracle. It was a catastrophic failure. It was treated as damage to goods and was punished swiftly and brutally. A brothel owner would induce a miscarriage through a horrifying variety of methods: toxic castor potions, blunt force blows to the belly, or forcing the woman to lift unbearable weights until her body broke. Medical papyri even describe clandestine abortions performed with sharpened wooden sticks inserted directly into the womb. If a birth could not be prevented, it happened in the same place the woman worked, alone, on a filthy straw mat, with no midwives, no medicine, and no hygiene. Many mothers died from blood loss or infection. If the mother survived, her child's fate was sealed. Archaeologists regularly find the tiny bones of newborns in the drains and refuse heaps of ancient brothels. Infanticide was routine and expected. A slave's child only meant extra costs and lost workdays. In this impossibly cruel world, a mother killing her own child was not an act of malice. It was, as one account tragically noted, the sole mercy they could offer. A final, desperate act of love to spare their child from entering the same living hell. Was there any way out? Could a woman ever rise above her station? The answer is no. There was only the illusion of advancement, a gilded cage that was just as secure as an iron one. Occasionally, a porner might become the favorite of her owner or a wealthy client. She might be moved to a private room, given fine jewelry, and dressed in silk instead of coarse wool. But this luxury came at a price. Constant surveillance and the terrifying knowledge that her entire existence hinged on one man's whim. He could cast her back into the common brothel for the smallest offence, or simply kill her for defiance. The true nature of her status was revealed in a common custom of the Athenian elite. A master would gift his favourite mistress to his friends as a gesture of hospitality. She would be expected to spend the night with his guest, then return to her lord the next day, treated, as one writer noted, like a precious goblet lent to a dear friend. Even at the absolute pinnacle of the slave hierarchy, a woman remained a beautiful, expensive object, nothing more. The golden chains, though more comfortable, bound her just as tightly as the iron ones. In the end, her fate was the same as all the others, a nameless death and total oblivion. The final, and perhaps greatest horror, was not how these women died, but how they were forgotten. Upon death, a porner was denied the sacred Greek burial rites that were essential for passage into the afterlife. Her body was hauled beyond the city walls and dumped in a ravine or an unmarked pit. No tombstone, no epitaph, no memory. It was a deliberate erasure from the human story. This erasure was an active cultural project. In the famed theatre of Dionysus, audiences roared with laughter at the comedies of Aristophanes, where prostitutes were portrayed as vulgar creatures deserving of mockery and blows. The pain of women was a punchline. This normalization of cruelty seeped into daily life. Vase paintings and wine cups, used in homes and at parties, were decorated with scenes of gang rapes and sadistic acts. Violence against women became a form of decorative art. This entire system wasn't a dirty secret. It was a cornerstone of the Athenian state, funneling a steady stream of tax revenue into the city's treasury. While Socrates taught virtue on the Agora, hundreds of women were being sold as living goods just blocks away. While Pericles delivered soaring speeches about Athens' glorious spirit, the city was profiting from human trafficking. The gleaming marble of the Parthenon itself was paid for, in part, with the blood and suffering of these nameless slaves. For centuries, modern history books and tourist trails have continued this whitewash, sanitizing antiquity to protect its grandeur. They praise the philosophy and ignore the bodies it was built on. But the silent ghosts of these tens of thousands of women still haunt the city's ruins, demanding that their story, at last, be told.